Darby and Friends, 1490 WGCH and WGCH.com, anywhere. Have you ever had an experience where you meet someone for the very first time, you have had no pre-press about who you're meeting, and yet you feel a connection as though perhaps you've known them a lifetime? There's something in their spirit, their soul, that radiates out to you and touches your heart in the most profound and powerful way. A few weeks ago, I was at a dinner party of neighbors, and a woman, I'd never seen her before in my entire life, was there in the kitchen sipping a glass of Chardonnay, and I came into the kitchen to do the same. We met. And as we started to talk, the personality that was revealed to me caused me to realize this is a very special woman. And she is our guest today, Joyce Lilly. Welcome, Joyce.
Thank you, Darby. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. It's a beautiful place to be in Greenwich.
Yes, and you've lived in a lot of different places, but before we get to your different homes and the reasons why, you've written a book. And this book, I am so not a crier, and I am so not a nonfiction reader. And this book is nonfiction, and tears literally poured down my cheeks nonstop when I finished the book. Powerful story about you and your husband. Where do you think you'd like to start the journey with us about how it got started? Or do you want to start with your husband, Ralph? Or where does it feel comfortable for you to begin?
Well, let me start, first of all, by saying it's really my husband's book. He started writing this book in probably 2018. He was a neurologist. He passed away in October of 21. But he was a neurologist, and in 1980, he suffered a very serious brain injury. So this book is a memoir about his recovery, and it's also about brain injury. It's not a scientific book. It's a memoir of his recovery, his injury, and it's a memoir from about 8 of his patients, from their healers, hence the name of the book, Second Lives, The Journey of Brain Injury Survivors and Their Healers. So the message that Ralph always wanted to put forward with his conversations with people and with this book are probably a few. One of them that he was always very famous for saying is that all roads lead to the brain. In other words, all of our behavior stems from our brain. Everything that happens to us, everything that we learn, and of course, if there's a brain disease or a trauma, it impacts upon your brain, which then impacts upon your behavior. So I could start by reading something, if you like, from the beginning of the book.
Oh, yes, please.
This is Ralph writing this as soon as he woke up from a coma. Like an automobile with a repaired starter, I suddenly woke up. For 2 weeks, I'd been in and out of consciousness. As I tried to move my arms, I found myself strapped to a bed in a medium-sized white room with a curtain on the right. My neck couldn't move, my eyes searched for something, but saw only meaningless images. It was as if I had wakened to nothing. I noticed a figure in a white coat standing at the foot of the bed looking at me. Where am I? In the hospital. You were in a motorcycle crash. What's a hospital? What's a motorcycle? The white-jacketed figure smiled. He seemed to know that I often turned up at the hospital on the motorcycle, but I never would again. I did not choose to end my first life and my midlife crisis in such a dramatic fashion. I was separated from my wife, Janet, and was now seeing a woman I'll call Naomi. We were going to the final session of a Chinese cooking class. The evening of May 29, 1980, was warm and dry, and since the ride from Phoenix to Scottsdale was short, we decided to take my road motorcycle. When the class ended, Naomi and I smiled at each other as we mounted my bright white 1960 Yamaha and carefully exited onto Hayden Road. We stopped at the red light behind two vehicles, and we were about to cross the Hayden-Osborne intersection. The sun was setting, the brightness of its glow partially obscured by trees lining the street. We both looked to the right, checking for oncoming traffic in anticipation of the signal turning green. We didn't see the speeding red sedan only a few feet behind us, nor did we notice the driver's head bobbing in a drunken stupor at the steering wheel. The driver didn't see our motorcycle, its passengers, or the red light. His sedan struck us from behind. The impact hurled me into a 50-mile-an-hour flight, the velocity matching the speed of the car as it slammed into the cycle. There was no air traffic control for this one-man flight, a traumatic equivalent of an explosive device. So that's taken from the very beginning of the book, and it's another thing that I would like to give as a message, and that is these things happen in a split second. You could be walking down the street and get hit by a car. You could be sitting at on a motorcycle like Ralph was and be smashed by a drunk driver. And people, of course, don't know Ralph, but he was 6'5" and 250 pounds. So when this car hit his motorcycle, he flew over the car in front of him. If you can picture this huge man flying over the car in front. He went under the car in front of that car, and his head and his helmet lodged underneath the axle.
Oh, dear God.
So this just happens in 2 seconds. It was over. His first life ended at that point, and his second life began because he didn't die, although the accident was written up in the Scottsdale paper as a fatality. So he didn't show any signs of life, but he was carted off to the hospital and was in a coma in and out for 2 or 3 weeks. I did not know him at that time. I didn't meet him till a couple of years later.
That's really an extraordinary. You know, I think that there's this misconception that if you wear a helmet, you're safe.
Well, you're safer. I mean, he would have been dead.
Yes.
But you're not safe, but you're much safer if you have a helmet.
Right. So then the whole new journey, his second life had to begin. Would you say his recovery and ability to have a new life, new relationships, really is unique and extraordinary? Or is this something that he made part of his mission to help more people also achieve this?
Well, it's not unique necessarily for people who have a brain injury or some kind of a brain trauma, be it surgery or a disease, because your life as you knew it before that trauma or before that incident will be changed forever. And your second life is such that you do perhaps need to make new relationships or new definitions for who you are. As I mentioned, Ralph had been a neurologist. He was in practice with 2 other physicians in Scottsdale. So he treated headaches and migraines and Parkinson's disease and that type of thing, and saw the occasional trauma patient in the hospital. However, after his injury, he was out of work for a couple of years, and during that time, he refocused his career to neurobehavior. And neurobehavior is the study of how the behavior is altered after an insult to the brain, whether it be traumatic or a disease, as I mentioned, or a tumor or surgery. But anything that interrupts the normal pathways of your brain is going to kind of, by definition, affect your behavior, because your behavior stems from your brain. So there are incidences in the book that he writes about how it changed his behavior. And then, as I said, there are about 8 stories from other brain injury survivors that Ralph treated over the years. And the stories are narrated really by their healers, usually wives or mothers, but people who are there to help usher that person into their second life. And really, it's people who have good healers, who have people who are standing by them, who really tend to do the best, because many times the brain-injured person's judgment may be skewed, their behavior may be off, and if they have a healer there guiding them, it can mean a huge difference for their lives. For example, I don't have a quote for this research, but it's said that 60% of the people in our prison systems who are incarcerated have had brain injuries.
Wow.
And it's amazing when you think about that. And I would say most of them did not have good aftercare and didn't have healers that were able to be effective for whatever reason.
Well, it could be domestic abuse right from childhood.
Right.
Just bang the kid up against the side of the head till it stops crying, passes out.
That's right. But, a lot of people get in different altercations
Sure.
or fights or whatever the case may be. And many times it goes unrecognized. Someone might have a head injury and they don't bother to go to the hospital, but they've had a concussion or maybe they have several. And
they may not have insurance.
Right,
They may not
that's
be
true.
able to afford health care.
That's true.
There are so many different component parts. So it's interesting, if I understand what you were saying, and I did read the book, and so I think I have a general point of view. There are many types of brain traumas, but the general overview result is a change in personality, a totally different life. You need someone who's a healer to come back, and different people will come back at different levels, whether it's a woman polo player or it's a child who's incredible at shooting. There are all these different examples in the book, but the situation is the same. Once the trauma has happened, do you pay attention? The woman was driving me crazy. Why did she keep putting herself in harm's way? Was the polo player.
Oh, the polo player, yeah.
It was like, stop, stop.
Ralph kept telling her that, too. You've got to stop playing polo. Eventually, she stopped. But, yeah, there's all kinds of examples. You mentioned a child who's excellent at shooting. One of the stories in the book is about Levi Coppage, who was 13 at the time of his brain injury. And the gun malfunctioned, and so he shot himself.
Right. So let's take a quick break, and when we come back, you'll tell us the rest of that story.
Okay.
How does that sound, Joyce?
Sounds great.
We have Joyce Lilly, the wonderful author of Second Lives, along with her former, he's still her husband, Ralph Lilly, deceased, unfortunately, and Diane Kramer. You're listening to Darby and Friends, 1490 WGCH and WGCH.com anywhere. Welcome back to Darby and Friends, 1490 WGCH and WGCH.com anywhere. Today I have Joyce Lilly with me. She is the author with her husband, Ralph Lilly, doctor, and Diane Kramer. It is a memoir, a nonfiction, a most extraordinary life of Dr. Ralph Lilly that is captured in this book with a combination of testimonials of people who knew Ralph and people who have read the book, and also the stories of the healing and the healers that have gone on. Just before we went to break, we were beginning to talk about the lady polo player. And there's polo in Greenwich, so we're always really interested in what happens to polo players potentially.
Well, we got involved with polo because we lived in a condo in Houston. On the floor of our building, there was a guy who had a polo team. So he invited us one day. Ralph and I had never been to polo, but we went to the Houston Polo Club, and we were sitting in his box seats, and it was so exciting, and the horses are galloping down the 125-yard polo field, and Ralph and I were just riveted by the action, but we were kind of also riveted by the fact that there were no emergency staff or people there. So after the game, which thankfully had no accidents, we went up to Jeff Annan, who had invited us that day, and we said, Jeff, you all need to have some emergency people here. Suppose someone gets smashed on the ground or gets hit by a polo ball. And he said, you're right. So Ralph, a few weeks after that, the board at the Houston Polo Club invited Ralph to become the medical director, so we went to polo every single game.
Oh, lucky.
And Ralph was instrumental in getting emergency people there for every game, and it was good that that he did that, because there were times when they were needed, and had they not been there, the results wouldn't have been so fortuitous. But I also mentioned Levi Coppage, who was a 13-year-old boy who was practicing to be in the Junior Olympics. He was a shooter, a skeet shooter. And he was practicing with his dad the last day before they were going to Colorado Springs to compete. And he took aim with his rifle, and they released the skeet. I don't know exactly what the term is, but he shot it. And the barrel of the rifle disconnected from the gun and came back and lodged in his frontal lobes, on his forehead.
In a million, you wouldn't expect that to happen.
Yeah, and he didn't even lose consciousness.
Oh.
And so the EMTs came and took him away, and they put him out when he was in the ambulance. But Levi now is a father, and he lives in Texas. And I went, and I had the privilege of having dinner with him and his 2 kids and his wife
a few
months ago. Yes, I do.
Yeah.
It's in the book. And so he still has some deficits, and his mother is really still his healer, and his wife Tina, but they are wonderful with him, and Levi is great. He's working. But he has still has some problems managing money and things like that. That's all in the book, so I'm not divulging any secrets. But, everyone's injuries are different, and I have another one here I can read to you if you'd like me to. This jumps forward a little bit when Ralph and I have moved to Texas, which is several years after his accident.
Just briefly, how you and Ralph met.
We met because after Ralph's injury, as I mentioned, he was out of work for 2 years, and he was always wanting to get back to work and always thinking about what he could do, and his previous partners couldn't take him back. But one day he saw an ad in the Neurology Journal that Brown University and Butler Hospital in Providence were looking for a neurobehavior person, and he had done a fellowship at UCLA the previous year. It was a year after his injury, but a year before he came to Butler. So anyway, sounds a little disjointed, but it's all in the book. So anyway, he came and interviewed for that position as a neurobehavior specialist at Brown and Butler Hospital, and they offered him the job, and he took it. And so he was the director of neurological services at Butler Hospital associated with Brown University, and he used to laugh at himself because he said, I was the director of one, just me, but I was thrilled. And so he came to Providence, and we met because I was a nurse at the time at Butler Hospital.
But you're really a lawyer.
I'm a lawyer now.
Yes.
Yes. So I went back to
Second lives for everybody.
That's right. I went back to law school in 1986. So this little story I'm going to read to you is, again, it's from the book, and it's probably about 1995. So Ralph and I spent 9 years in Providence, and then he accepted a job in Texas. And that whole segue is in the book as well. So during this time, Ralph cared for many patients at Neurobehavioral Institute of Houston and at the Texas Medical Center in Houston. He often shared their stories with me. I would cry and shake my head. I truly believe that Ralph was spared after his crash to do this work, which he so passionately enjoyed despite the sadness of every case. One patient was a young man, 20 years old, who'd been in a head-on crash in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The insurance case manager called Ralph and told him that the patient was going to be sent to a nursing home in Houston because he could only move one eye, but that they would pay for him to stay at Neurobehavioral Institute of Houston for 3 months to see what Ralph and Dr. Cassidy could do for him. Now, anyone who knows insurance companies knows this is very unusual for an insurance company to look for ways to spend money for a patient. But this case manager had worked with Ralph and Dr. Cassidy before and knew the magic that they could do. This young man arrived in September. Ralph told me the story, the crash, how his mom was always in the room, a big poster on the wall of Garth Brooks, his favorite country singer. He was just this side of a vegetative state and could move one eye. Of course I cried. The case had special meaning for Ralph because his own brother died from a head-on crash in the early 1950s, coincidentally also in Baton Rouge.
Oh.
He was about 20 and had just joined the Army and was coming home for the holidays. No doubt Ralph couldn't help but think, if only his brother had suffered his traumatic brain injury a few decades later, perhaps he too would have survived. A mere 6 months after the young man arrived at Neurobehavioral Institute of Houston, Ralph and I actually took him to see Garth Brooks at the Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo. This always brings tears to my eyes because I remember that night like it was yesterday. He had to use a wheelchair. He enjoyed barbecue and was ecstatic to see his hero Garth on stage. He had transformed from a person who could only move one eye to a young man on the road to recovery. His transformation was evidence that it matters where a brain-injured person gets treated and by whom. This young man eventually returned to work. It was a miraculous detour from a nursing home and probable death to a second life. And we lost track of him because he went back to work. And he, he had his second life.
The stories are just, they're so life-affirming. There's something about, so much of our day-to-day news is a downer. And yet you read this book, and every page gives you a reason to believe in others, believe in the power of the healer, people who want to help one another. This goes beyond religion, goes beyond politics, goes beyond race, ethnicity. It's human being to human being doing good.
Yes, Ralph was really all about that. Even before his injury, he was a very much loved and caring person. But after his injury and when he went back to work as a neurobehavior doctor, he was just so empathetic with his patients because he had been there, so he knew what they were going through. He didn't talk about it a lot. So many of, even my friends who have read the book, have called me and said, Joyce, I didn't know that Ralph went through all this. And I say, yeah, but because he wasn't a complainer. He didn't focus on the past. He did talk about brain injury and the fact that helmets are important and that your whole life can change in an instant. But many of the things that are written in the book that Ralph shared in his part of the memoir, even I didn't know about because he just didn't complain. He didn't sit and whine and tell me all the miserable things that had happened to him. So it's helpful for people, I think, to read this book because it can be very uplifting. And I would like to read one comment from a woman that I just received this comment yesterday because I had gone to a high school reunion and her husband was there. I knew her husband from high school, which is
goodness,
a lot of years ago. And so we sat down and talked, and I mentioned about the book, and I was going to come here to Greenwich and do an interview, and he then told me about his wife, who had brain surgery last September for a meningioma, which is a non-malignant brain tumor. So I told him about the book, and he must have bought it, because yesterday I get this message from her. Dear Joyce, you don't know me, but you know my husband, Tom. I wanted to reach out to you to thank you from the bottom of my heart for recommending yours and your husband's story. I can't begin to express how much it has helped me. After my brain surgery this past September, I've experienced so many of the struggles spoken about in Second Lives. I feel as if all of my struggles have been validated and that I am not alone in those struggles. My biggest complaint is the lack of mental help or awareness provided after surgery. I had no idea the lows that I would experience and am still navigating my way through to become who I am now. I am saddened for your loss, but what a blessing his words leave behind.
Wow, that's powerful. So the book is called Second Lives, and it's the journey of brain injury survivors and their healers. Ralph Lilly, MD, Diane Kramer with Joyce Stamp Lilly as the co-authors of this wonderful memoir. How do we get a copy?
Well, I'm going to stop by to Diane's Books tomorrow, which has been recommended to me by some friends here in Greenwich, and I'm hoping that she'll want to carry the book. So if she does, You can get it there, but she still will have to order it, so it won't be there for a little bit. But if she chooses not to carry it for some reason, the book is available on Amazon.com and on Barnes & Noble website.
Marvelous. We have all kinds of ways to, and I highly encourage everyone, because hopefully none of my listeners ever have to deal with brain trauma or injuries, but it's good to know that there is so much good news out there in the world of healers. Thank you so much to Joyce Lilly for being here with us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
You've been listening to Darby and Friends, 1490 WGCH and WGCH.com, anywhere.